Okay, hey, I just wanted to thank you for joining me today. Can you go ahead and just give us a quick introduction, who you are, where you work, that sort of thing?
Sure. So thank you for having me. My name is Michael Sierra-Arévalo. I'm a assistant professor at the Rutgers School of Criminal Justice, and I study policing, and police culture, more specifically how officers come to understand and practice their work as profoundly dangerous.
Okay, and you're in New Jersey. Are you in New Jersey right now, or are you near New York, or are you somewhere else? Or
No, so I live in Brooklyn and work in Newark, but I had a trip planned in early March to come home and see family. I'm originally from Texas, so my plan was to come and see family. And it turns out that about 3 days after I landed in Austin, uh, the landscape changed drastically. And so I've actually been here. I'm currently at some family's house. I've been here for several weeks. Unclear when I'll make it back to New York.
okay, and just to put this in time and space, if someone's watching this in the future, we're in the middle of the coronavirus outbreak right now. It's April 6th, and New York is about to hit the brunt of the death. So I'm glad that you're not in New York right now, and to anyone
Yeah,
who that's still there, best wishes to them, of course.
yeah.
So how did you come to study policing? Can you tell us what drew you to what drew your interest to the policing profession?
Sure. So my entree into policing was unexpected, and I think a lot of graduate students end up discovering is that they went in with a plan and everything changes very quickly. And so I went to graduate school in 2012, and my original plan was that I was going to study street gangs. And I specifically was interested in doing an ethnographic study, a comparative study of different gangs of different ethnicities and races. That was the idea that I had when I applied is how do gangs think about ideas of family and honor and respect, and does that differ across Black gangs, Latino gangs, white gangs. Um, I didn't know how ambitious that was when I applied, of course, but that is what I applied to do. And I actually got involved with violence reduction work through something called Project Longevity, which is a spin-off of some of the focused deterrence work that has been ongoing since the late 80s, early 90s, spearheaded by people like David Kennedy out of Boston. The Boston Ceasefire Initiative is the
Hmm.
kind of the original piece that spawned a lot of this work. And I got involved in that work. I was going to these call-ins, I was going and doing data collection, and it was in the course of that data collection that I met and spoke with officers in a non-enforcement context. So I had been contacted by police. I didn't grow up in a hyper-police community. If they were contacting me, it was because I did something wrong. So I had only ever experienced them in the context of car stops or in the context of shoplifting. I shoplifted when I was 15. Um, and then I met them for the first time, and their job was very special, clearly. It was different. And they talked with a certain blaseness about homicide and shootings. It was just that was the world that they inhabited, or at least that's the world they portrayed to me. But in other ways, they were just very mundane. They were a bunch of middle-aged white guys. They were all white. A lot of them spent a lot of time on the bench press or doing curls, but they weren't like that different from a lot of people that I'd met growing up in Texas, for example. They were politically conservative, talked about football, they complained about their bosses, their kids were doing well in school or bad in school. They were just really mundane, but they had this very special job. And they saw the world clearly in a very particular way as a result, or at least in conversation with this particular job. And so I noted all these things. They were all new to me, but I was still thinking about doing violence reduction work. I thought about doing a dissertation that was going to be maybe following some of the young men that were called in, maybe doing a study of the kind of the institutional arrangement of the police and the courts and the community and all that was in my head. And then Ferguson happened. And I think along with a lot of other people, for the first time, I was really reading and I realized like, wow, we don't know all that much about some very key
No.
questions about police. We don't know how many people are shot by the police. The one that got me was like, we didn't even know how many police we had. Like the last estimate, the last census was from 2008. and this is
Or
in
how many, even how many
2014.
agencies we have. We don't even know how many police agencies there
Yeah,
are in the United States.
yeah. We have these numbers, but you know, I use the same numbers, right? Approximately 18,000.
Approximately, right.
Um, but like that's like what, plus or minus what, 2 to I don't know, 4,000. Like it's not clear. And the last census was '08, and so that was the environment where I was thinking about, okay, so what data exists? Like, what could I use to answer some of these questions that I'm having, that I'm beginning to have? And then I kind of made the decision is that the administrative data is very limited. The seminal texts that we're still citing and still using, Skolnick, Wesley, Manning, Van Manen, like this stuff is literally between 30 and 50 years old. Some of the book, Rubenstein's City Police is talking about like the advent of radio. And
Mm-hmm.
I thought like, you know, like because of my violence reduction work, not just in, you know, I began this work in New Haven, but over the course of doing that work across the country, like I built connections, I built relationships with not just like individual agencies, but with people that left agencies and chiefs and people that knew other chiefs. And I was like, I have access, I can get access to these places. Um, and so that's when I made the choice. I originally wasn't interested in danger. I was actually interested in police suicide because I found like the factoid that way more officers take their own lives than are shot and killed in the line of duty every year. And so that was the original question, was suicide. But that's when I decided that that's what I wanted to do, was get into a police car and talk with officers and see myself what they actually do.
Okay. Just so you know, my perspective, where I'm coming from, I'm a former police officer. I left law enforcement finally in 2014 and decided to go back and get a PhD and study policing. I've been interested in the lethal use of force by police. It's something I had experienced as an officer, and I wanted to study it. And it just so happened that Ferguson took place a few months after I'd left the department finally. So I ended up here in St. Louis. I'm working with Dave Klinger right now on a project to
Mm-hmm.
create a database of people who died in the presence of police, and to start the process of getting a handle on, you know, who dies where and from what. But like you said, it's such an early stage, and there's so little that's been done on a culture that's so central to in our society. Everyone has encountered the police, deals with the police, thinks of the police. It's in our popular culture, it's something that we're sort of obsessed with. But when you look at the academic literature, it's a lot of it's just not there. And your work, what drew me to you, why I wanted to talk to you today, is just recently we had a death. A police officer in my former organization was murdered at work. And he was a really well-known and well-respected someone in the chain of command. And I know now that my former friends, well, still my friends, my former colleagues, and even myself, it's a traumatic event. You know, you think about this person that you knew, that you interacted with, and now they're gone. And then I was thinking about how these events are not just things that happen to individuals, but they happen to organizations. They happen in the regions and across the country. They can have an effect, and they create this sort of shared understanding. And I took a look in to see if anyone had written about this, and I came across your piece and read it, and I thought it really touched on something that's an important part of police culture. So I wanted to talk to you a bit about it today. But before we get going, you work with, you're using qualitative methods, so you're not like getting police records and measuring things and that. So can you just talk a little bit about the type of methods that you use, how you collect the data, how you process it, if you could?
Sure. Yeah. So I don't measure things in the way that you might measure things through things like a survey instrument, or even through a more standardized interview protocol. So my method as an ethnographer, and frankly, I think I get called an ethnographer, and I've even referred to myself as an ethnographer, but I'm a researcher that happens to have used ethnography in this particular project. And I think that lots of people could do ethnography. I say that as a caveat. I do other kinds of work too. But in this project, as I mentioned, saw some of the limitations in the data that we had. It was very piecemeal data. or if it was I mean, what is the data on culture that we have? There is some work, people like Ingram, Palini, Terrell have done some survey-based stuff. There's some survey-based measures, but they're about like a handful of departments. And as I describe in the paper, kind of in the front end, this sort of talks about culture as this, it's an outcome. It's just a thing that exists that presumably changes behavior. And the question of where does the culture come from? How is it maintained? How does it originate? How is it perpetuated across time, between officers, within officers? That's really hard to get at, A, with the measures that we currently have, but B, just generally speaking, that's something really sticky to try to get into with a survey instrument. And so ethnography as a method is particularly well designed to investigate questions of how and why, about process, about what, we talk about mechanism a lot in social science, but what is the way that we can understand this outcome as being the end result of something that's much more difficult to see that happens over time within very localized contexts. And so the ethnographic portion of it, which actually is very deeply intertwined with what Spradley and others, a really great new piece, Hiro and Braga's Tools of the Trade, or the Trade in Tools, is criminology. It's about illegal gun markets. Talks about Spradley in his discussion of the ethnographic interview. Others will talk about this as sort of an unstructured interview. But I go in the field. I do ride-alongs for the most part. And so for those that are unfamiliar with ride-alongs, most departments, but especially large urban developed professionalized departments will have a program. There'll be a form where you sign away all liability, so you can't sue the department of the city. Some of them institute a background check. I actually can't confirm if they actually ever run the background check. I think half of the battle is just like you say that you're okay with it. So it's like, okay, they said they're okay with it. I have no idea. And then you get to go on a ride along. And usually there's some list of things that you have to do, things that you can wear. Some departments have a very clear, like, no weapons whatsoever. Even if you're sworn on the ride along, you don't carry. Others are much more liberal about if you're active duty currently and sworn, then you can carry concealed, and that depends on the agency. So that's the context in which most of my observations are happening, right? And so my observations, I'm recording them either in a written notepad or a text editor on my phone. Oh, that kind of text on my, there it is, phone. And then I have a voice recorder where I have an application on my phone where I record the interview. And I say interview in quotes because I think people, when they have read interview studies, will think about the interview protocol. My interviews are free ranging. My interviews allow me, so if I'm talking to an officer who has been on the job 30 years, I might very well ask them about how they have seen policing change over 30 years. What are some big differences they see in policy or in training or in the different kinds of problems they face, or how they've reacted to body cameras, which were not a thing for the first 27 years of their career. If I'm talking to an officer who has been on for 6 months, I might ask them very different questions. I might ask them about their very recent academy experience. I might ask them about their perception of body cameras, since they don't know worlds without body cameras on patrol. And so the unstructured, or the ethnographic interview, is sort of just an informal conversation that I, as a researcher who becomes more and more familiar with the environment as you kind of go on, learn when to interject these sociological questions. And then I pull back. I pull back, and then we talk about tattoos, or we talk about weights or family or whatever the case might be. Because it turns out a 10-hour interview is just not tenable. You can't just ask questions for 10 hours. And so that is, broadly speaking, the method, is being in situ, body in the field, letting the context inform my question. So if we go to a shooting scene, I'm not going to ask about their perception of their chase policy. I'm going to ask them to explain to me what's happening on scene. Walk me through what we're doing here. Can you explain to me why we did this and not this, based on what I'm seeing in that moment? And I'm trying my best to record what they're saying, how they're explaining it. Sometimes it's audio recorded, sometimes it's in my notepad or it's in my phone. And then when you exit the field, you, of course, you write up a more complete narrative. And that becomes kind of the record of what you've seen. And as you kind of go in and out of the field, you're reviewing your notes. You're right. So I do memos to myself in my field notes with 3 exclamation points. So it's like I'll respond to what I'm writing up. And then that should inform your questions in the field when you go back. That's what allows you to begin this kind of recursive process of data collection, theory reformulation, as you move forward in the field. And ideally, as you move forward, your theory about the world that you're in is able to explain more and more about what you're seeing. And usually it ends up being broken by certain things. You got to go back and you got to rethink about your assumptions because someone says something or does something that you can't quite make sense of, if that makes sense.
So, and as you're seeing these, so you're with these officers, you're observing, you're having these discussions, you're recording, making your observations, and then you're coding those and analyzing those and forming new questions. And then you're also at the same time as you're seeing these emergent themes, you're consulting the literature to see what the literature says about what you're observing, or do you wait until the end? When do you sort of tie the theory, the academic literature to your observations? Is that an ongoing process or something you do at the end?
Sure. So I think that the way that it gets talked about, I don't know if I'm using the right term, like the theory of the method is that you could theoretically go in blank slate and you don't have any understanding of literature, you have no preconceptions, and it is utterly emergent from the field. That obviously is not the case. At least I say obviously, that wasn't the case for me. I had preconceptions, and I think responsible ethnographers, particularly after what has been discussed as this reflexive turn in ethnography, have and should be considering what their assumptions about the world they're entering are, and then having those actually be front and center when they're considering what am I choosing to record or not record, what am I
So when you
choosing to focus my attention on.
To walk back a second, when you say reflexive, you're talking about paying attention to what it is that you're bringing into the research space, what your preconceptions are, what you think you know about the subject. Am I tracking here?
That's one piece of it, right? So reflexivity insofar as understanding one's assumptions, but this gets wrapped in very close with the idea of positionality in research, right? So the gist is you doing the exact same project that I'm doing, we're going to get different kinds of data out of this.
Mm-hmm.
You're a white man, as far as I can tell. You're a former police officer. We have different ages. We presumably we're going to look different. We're going to move different in these spaces. We're going to have different ways of approaching questions and even interacting with people. And we're going to get different data. And so I think that for a long time, ethnographers were trained because of how their work was interpreted to basically like admit the sin of who they were and like, well, I can't be totally objective. And instead, I think there's been a turn to say that, yes, objectivity is a myth. And my presence is obviously affecting data, but we can understand the kinds of reactions that I'm getting. We can understand certain kinds of data points in a particularly useful way by considering the positionality of the researcher. So one great example that I always tell my students about is Amara Armenta. She's a professor at UCLA policy. Her book is Protect, Serve, and Deport. It was on local level immigration enforcement, I believe in Tennessee in a sheriff's department. And so when she would go on ride-alongs, she talks about in some of her article length work about how she was mistaken for the spouse of an officer. She was mistaken for potentially a dispatcher. Those are two things that I was never confused for. Nobody ever thought that I was married to an officer or the boyfriend of an officer or the husband of a female officer. Never came up. Definitely not a dispatcher. I was confused for a federal agent who was there as part of like a consent decree, a reporter, or somebody that wanted to join the police department. That in and of itself is indicative of the environment of the police department. This is a male-centric, hyper-masculine space that I'm able to move through. Maybe the word easily is not the correct way to say it, but I am able to move in a very different way from someone like Amara is in that space. And we're both Latino. So one commonality is that we both are bilingual and we could translate for officers, which they loved. They loved
Mhm.
having someone who spoke Spanish in the car. That's something we had in common. But there were also very clear differences. And so when I say reflexive, it's about keeping in mind that not only we bring assumptions, but we ourselves we affect the data, and making sense of the data with that in mind. Your original question was like, where does the literature come in? For me, the literature informs the question, and then kind of, obviously I was still reading things, and I would inform what I was developing. Like, I didn't come up with the idea in some of my work on the cultural construction of danger. That I didn't make that up. But that became a useful way of making sense of what I was seeing, was that you can amplify certain dangers over others. You make choices that resonate within the cultural context that you're in. And so that was all kind of just, I think we write the methods pieces in a way that make it seem like there's a clear set of steps, like, oh, you do literature here, and then you don't touch literature again until you get here. And instead, it's a much more amorphous soup that you're kind of in, where you're kind of among data, and you're writing field notes, and then you're still in the field, and it's all kind of moving as this mass. I I don't know if I'm doing it right or not, but that's how I did it.
Okay, that's fantastic. Just to transition now, you'd mentioned earlier this shared cultural understanding, this idea of danger among police
Mm,
officers. Could you talk a little bit about uh, this shared understanding that police officers have? Just touch on that for a moment.
sure. So when I say a shared understanding, I guess I mean that there is sort of this unassailable axiom within policing as an occupation, and among officers themselves, and maybe even more simply, is that there's just an understanding that you could die on this job. Um, Now, other jobs have that. I think implicitly, gas station workers know that you could die, and so do construction workers, or deep sea fishermen, or firefighters. Everyone knows that, and depending on the job, professors, I guess, know that they could die in like a freak coffee making accident, I suppose. Um, but it's just less central to their understanding of what they do. And so I think for police, the shared understanding is that I think you'd be very hard pressed to find an officer, a patrol officer in the US, who does not understand and appreciate that the work that they are in is one in which their life could be ended by another human being. And that's something that's different about policing. Matthew Desmond talks about firefighting on the fire line. This is ethnography of wildland firefighting. And, you know, it's an incredibly dangerous job to fight wildland wildland fires. And in some ways, he talks about the fire, and others talk about the fire as like a thing that does stuff. But fire doesn't actually have any agency. Fire has no morality. And I think in policing, because you're dealing with humans, it becomes much easier to think about the fundamental reality and defining characteristic of your work as being that somebody else, another human, could choose to end your life. And that is shared among officers. Everyone just understands that. There can be variation in how much you believe that, and what steps you take to make sure that you go home alive. But there's a reason why everyone, when they say goodbye, says be safe. It's just like a knee jerk. Everyone just says it. Everyone just says be safe, be safe, be safe. That didn't just originate from the ether. That was something that was socialized and taught and encouraged within that context.
I think I actually signed off to one of my emails with you with "Be safe."
Yeah, and I learned to do that when I was interacting with officers very early on.
Okay. One thing that I'm envisioning you have this interest in policing. You're out doing your research, you're doing ride-alongs, you're making observations, you're conducting these very informal interviews, allowing them to take you where they take you, depending on the call, what you're observing. and you see this theme of this shared sense of danger among this axiom that exists, that you could die on the job. You see it being expressed, and you talk about artifacts as being
Mm,
these things that you're observing. When people hear the word or read the word artifact, I think it's not something they associate with modern police officers. Can you just talk a little
sure.
bit about how modern police officers out doing their jobs, what types of artifacts might they leave for a sociologist or an anthropologist to observe and draw meaning from?
Sure. Um, that's a good question, and I'm glad you said anthropology, because that's probably what we associate most closely with this idea of artifacts. And this is not in the sense of, I mean, frankly, it is. It's not unlike what you would think about if you were to find a shard of pottery or an old book or some kind of tablet. I think in a couple hundred years, if you were to find a police shield with a black ribbon across it, that would very much be what we would consider, if you were an anthropologist, an artifact of sorts. And that's kind of more what the term is, I think, referring to, is sort of like the observable outcomes or the observable things resulting from a culture. Observable, I think, could be misleading, because we would also consider stories and myths. Those are artifacts. Those are things that are emergent from a particular culture that inform, as I discussed in the paper, this idea of a collective memory. I don't need to write down a story about somebody being attacked on patrol for that to be a deep and enduring part of how people are trained and how they understand their work. You know, we don't have to have a shadow box in the department that says Crawford Avenue for that to be the same place that you were taught in the academy that 2 officers died on this day, and that they took you to in the academy and showed you the corner where these officers died. And so artifact, in the simplest sense, is something that is both a product and a contributor to this culture, which, you know, broadly defined. And I say this with the very heavy caveat that far smarter people than me have tried to define culture, and we have a dozen different ways of defining it as toolkit or as a frame or other kinds of ways. But broadly speaking, it's a sort of a collection of values, of assumptions, of norms that typify a certain group or a certain context. And the context and the group are very much intertwined in most cases. And so the artifact, to your original question, is a thing that they use or display, or which simply is just there, that is indicative of their culture, which reproduces that culture over time.
Okay, and in the paper, you talk about how these artifacts, they generate this shared collective memory, and part of that collective memory, it's like reinforcing this sense of danger, and how that that's is spread over both space and time.
Mm,
And one thing I noted is there was sort of like this this national level, and then lower levels of analysis all the way down to the individual. You have these artifacts that
mm.
are reinforcing this shared culture. Can you just talk a little bit about, and maybe provide us with some examples, some of the things that you observe, some of the artifacts that you observed that led you to gain a better understanding of how this shared memory is created across both time and space? So geography, but also in time, like going back in time and forward in time, how this shared culture is generated and via these artifacts.
Sure. Yeah. So I think that one good example of uh, an organizational artifact, and I draw the distinction in the paper, which is that you can have the departments themselves, they create and maintain these artifacts, these reminders. And I think the most obvious one is memorial walls. So no individual officer puts together a slab of black marble or creates an entire hallway in a substation dedicated to the deaths of officers. That's something that is supported by the organization itself. Now, granted, individuals make decisions within the organization, and that's always kind of a tension in these discussions of organization versus individuals, that there's no such thing as like the police department signs. Someone at the top signs on the dotted
Mhm.
line for certain decisions. Um, but when you look at a memorial wall, as an example, they tend to be public. So these are not locked away in the back room of a police department. They're usually accessible to the public. And in some sense, if we think back to our Manning, right, the dramaturgical approach to policing, they're managing the public's view of the police, and the police are portraying a certain version. They're highlighting a certain component, a certain facet of their work, and that particular facet is danger. It is the death that can come as a result of doing police work. They are permanent. You can't really move that memorial, not easily anyways. They are historical. It's not just the most recent officer killed in the line of duty. In the West River Police Department, there are dozens of names on this wall that go back 100-odd years. The same in the Elmont Police Department, right? When you walk in headquarters, along one wall, it's the picture, if they're available, and sometimes the deaths are so long ago there are no pictures, a headshot of every officer killed in the line of duty, the day they died, where they were, and how they were killed. And these are organizational artifacts that, again, they maintain the sense that policing is currently dangerous. People die today. They died then. They all wore the same shield. They all police the same city. And this is a historical constant. This is unchanging, at least in the version of history that is being shown by the department. And for individuals, I think a really good example that I think merges very well this idea of history and individual is tattoos. By their very nature, they're permanent. And so in West River, for example, I was on tattoos. Did you get the tattoos part, or?
Yes.
Okay. And so I think for individual level artifacts, tattoos provide another good example about how in the moment they're responding to circumstances that are very present. And that over time they become these historical reminders of what has happened. And so when officers are tattooed with the names or images that commemorate the deaths of their colleagues, at the time, let's call it the year 2000. By the time I'm talking to them in 2016, the children of those dead officers are going to college. The officers that are joining the police department were 3 or 4 years old sometimes when those officers died. They don't remember those officers. They never met them. But if you are in the same squad as that sergeant with that tattoo, you are going to see a physical manifestation of that artifact. And for the officer who's tattooed, you would arguably never forget what happened anyways, because they were your friends, not just your colleagues. These are people that barbecue together, that go on vacations together, that are godfathers of each other's children, have been in each other's weddings, have gone to funerals of other officers together before. But the tattoo is this individual decision that the organization didn't make, the individual made and maintains themselves. And again, brings this kind of over time. And so that is all happening at the organizational level in the context of West River or Sunshine or Elmont or whatever the city is. And then when you want to blow it up, so I make the argument that there are ways that these things are commemorated that also link departments across space. And so I can go to Sunshine, which is this department in the Southwest. It's 1,000 miles from New York City, but there's a commemorative display of the officers killed on 9/11. So that it very quickly distills both the time and space component. The officers that are walking in and out of that station every day don't have any personal connection to the officers killed 20 years ago. They are, again, 1,000 miles away. But those officers are part of the same occupation. It might have been a terrorist attack 20 years ago in a very different place, but what the occupation teaches you, what you learn in the academy, what officers remind each other of all the time, is that it can happen anywhere, at any time, for no reason, really. And it's just a matter of happenstance that there was these officers on this day that perished, because it could have been you. And more importantly, they signed on knowing that risk, just as you signed on knowing that risk. And so this is something that officers share, regardless if it be the shootings in Dallas, which happened while I was in the field, or Baton Rouge, or New York City. These are all events that while they may affect individual departments at any given time, departments are very willing to commemorate those things permanently, such as that display, or temporarily, like the black bands that go across chests, that go across badges. They will send officers to funerals across the country. For officers in the Dallas shootings, officers from across the world came to those funerals. The departments that I was in observing sent officers to those funerals. And so these are all ways in which the death of an officer is in time zones away that is meaningful to officers at the local level, and is remembered for a long time. Dallas is not going to be forgotten for half a century.
When I was reading the piece, I thought back to my time. I was an instructor at the police academy, and one thing I'm sure you're familiar, the Officer Down Memorial page. I think you mentioned it. And what we would do, and I went through this process myself, is when an officer died anywhere in the country, the first thing we would do that next morning is went through the recruits. I think there's like 45 or 50 recruits, and every recruit would have an opportunity. They were required to do it, is to stand up, and we would put the Officer Down Memorial page on the projector, and they would read aloud to the class what had happened, the nature of the incident, and how the officer died. And for us, at an officer level, training future officers, we understood that we were generating this sense of understanding that hey, when you do this job, you could die, that you're entering an organization that's connected to a larger fraternity of a brotherhood, a sisterhood of people who are doing a job where they could die, and here are examples. And you're putting these young people most of the time who are under a lot of stress, who are being indoctrinated into a new culture, military environment. A lot of them are unfamiliar with them, and then you stand them up and in front of all of their peers and the people that are in charge of them, and you have them read this. I was just thinking what a powerful moment that is at an individual level. For me, hearing those when I was a recruit on a daily basis, and as an officer, reinforcing that in the next generation of police officers across time and space, I think that event really, that ceremony is something that's important in generating this shared understanding. Now, can you talk a little bit about what do you think so you're generating this shared this understanding, this shared sense of danger in the profession. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what the implications of that could be?
Sure. So one thing that I always have to try and do, and I do it, I think, a little bit in the piece, but I think it's this tension, is that I try to make clear that some of the outcomes of this emphasis on officer safety and danger are not in and of themselves inherently bad things. So one thing that we know, stemming back from some of the earliest work on this, people like Skolnick in Justice Without Trial, is cohesion. Intense loyalty and trust between officers, and I believe it was Van Manen who wrote something to the effect of, in this particular environment, you can't really afford to stop and ask questions all the time if you need to act right this moment. You just have to expect someone is going to help you regardless of the situation. And there are moments where that understanding is necessary to preserve life. And that is, I think, an uncomfortable truth for people critical of the police, like myself included, that there are moments, and that violence is not like the movies, that it's quick, it is far more brutal than most people understand, and the outcomes are not neat. That is the most sympathetic view of some of the outcomes, is that you get behavior amongst officers that is necessary to keep them and others alive. The problem is that it also creates this unassailable justification for all sorts of stuff. Officer safety becomes this boilerplate justification for everything and anything. It becomes a way of excusing the most heinous acts of police violence. And I say heinous because I've had officers in a car with me justify to me why Tamir Rice was shot on the grounds of officer safety, why the shooting in South Carolina and Walter Scott was shot in the back. I had officers explain to me why that was for officer safety reasons. And it just, you can spin out this logic of, well, you could be shot and killed at any time, thus ad absurdum. And it makes the actions of police officers very difficult to hold to any kind of standard if we, as we are empowered to do within the legal system underneath the Fourth Amendment in Graham v. Connor, to prize officer perception largely above everything else. And so these two things are in conversation. The legal protections at play, including qualified immunity, including the reasonableness standard that currently governs force and other seizures, that is both cause and consequence of the culture. Departments' use of force policies currently are moving away from the stepwise continuum and are becoming much more akin to this thing. I feel like I'm explaining to someone that knows this much better than I do, but the force, just like the force wheel or the force option model, where actually it's not about go up or down a continuum. It's not even really about a matrix. It's all about, based on my perception at the time, what are my options? And that both seems like a good guideline, but also means that there's no actual way to objectively say whether or not you made the right choice or not. And you end up relying on judges who are more or less sympathetic to the perspective and the position of police to decide whether or not those things are reasonable under the law, whatever that means. A great piece is, it's now old, it's dated, but it's still awesome. I think it's How Reasonable is a Reasonable Man. And I could find the citation for you if you would like, but it kind of lays out this logic very simply. And so when we think about the implications of this culture, it's that this culture is not just in a vacuum, it is in play with laws and with policies and with training. And the current culture is designed in such a way, I say designed as if somebody sat down and like made a playbook for the culture. I think better it's that the culture has been perpetuated and has arisen in such a way that you are creating fertile ground for the misuse of police powers, for the perpetuation of a occupational and professional context that, even if, and it does, in my opinion, see the problems in many cases, is not designed to hold the worst cases accountable. It is actually designed in such a way to provide ample room for the protection of the quote unquote bad apples. And I hate getting into that discussion of bad apples. It's a systems problem, it's a structures problem. But the structure is designed in a way that actually protects more than punishes these quote unquote bad apples.
So you see both some utility, but you're also saying that because we were so reliant on this reasonableness standard, what would a reasonable officer do if part of being a reasonable officer is this shared understanding of I could be killed at any time, that emboldens, or not, emboldens it. It gives a considerable amount of leeway to police officers to do things that we would on face most citizens would look at it, and most officers should look at it and say that's just completely unreasonable. But because police officers have this shared sense that they could die at any time, that they can get away with pretty much anything. Is that what you're kind of getting at? I would agree.
Yeah, I think it's close. And I at this point I would point people towards the work of Seth Stoughton. He's got, I think the piece is Garrett and Stoughton, the Tactical Fourth Amendment. And so what they argue in that piece is that a lot of current judicial decisions, they say that they care about things like training and what the reasonable officer would do, but those things are actually utterly separate from consideration of what do officers actually get trained to do. And so if you're going to talk about reasonableness, it's like, well, we could be better about defining what that is and what are best practices, because some of these shootings that happen, not only would a lay person look at them and say like, yeah, that's bad, but any officer with any level of tactical training, any level of reasonable training goes like, yeah, that's a bad shoot all day.
Yeah.
No general order says that you could do that. Like no department policy would say that you should do those things. But that is separate from current decisions in a lot of use of force cases.
Right. And part of my job is to sit here and watch police shootings, read police shootings, over and over, just thousands of them. And on a regular basis, I see things and I'm like, wow, it's just completely unacceptable. And most of the time it's just officers apparently, as an observer, with some expertise in tactics, it's blatantly obvious that they haven't been well trained, that they're scared and they don't have any tools in their tool belt and don't know what to do, and they do things that are just outlandish. But this idea that, well, it's a dangerous job and they could be killed at any time, so we're gonna consider it's acceptable. We let things go that we probably shouldn't, and I think it's because of this just shared understanding that you talk about. So I really appreciate your time. Just to wrap things up, I wanted to just ask you one final question, for civilians, so for people who don't have any experience in law enforcement, people who have no background, who read your paper, what would you want to be sort of the biggest takeaway, something that they could take away from your paper?
That's a good question. So someone that doesn't know much about police. So I think that part of what I've always tried to do with this style of work, and by style I mean like I go and talk to officers themselves, is that I'm trying to provide space and shed light on the perspective of people that I think a lot of people in the public think they know something about. We're inundated with images of what police do, what their work is, who they are, and it is by and large like wholly inaccurate for a whole bunch of reasons. I think what I want people to understand from the paper is that the culture of police, and I say that like, police culture, capital P, capital C, is not an accident. This is actively maintained by processes within and across departments. It is sticky. It is incredibly resilient to time. As I mentioned in the paper, we are empirically at one of the safest times, if not the safest times in the history of policing. But the emphasis on danger is very much the case. And if you hear the rhetoric, it's actually worse than it's ever been, which is just empirically untrue. And so the reality of culture, particularly with regard to how they think about danger and violence and death, is very sticky and it's very resistant to change. That said, if police maintain the culture, that by definition means that they could also change the culture. It will not be easy. It cannot just be top down. So a department removing the memorial wall, which is not what I would advocate, by the way. I think that any group, any person deserves to mourn, and they deserve to honor people that have died. I think that's like, I don't want to get too far down the road, but it's a human thing to mourn and to remember. But this cannot just be a change at the top. This is something that officers, when they clip out newspaper clippings and get tattoos and display pictures and images, that is also contributing to culture. And so this cannot be checking boxes for captains and never getting down to the locker room to look at the stickers on the inside of their patrolmen's lockers. It can't, this is about Punisher stickers. For those that don't know, the Punisher is the vigilante Marvel superhero that kills criminals instead of arresting them. That a lot of officers wear their patches like on their bulletproof vest and have stickers on their trucks. And that is culture. That is a manifestation of culture and something that contributes to a certain view of the world. And so it's both testament to the difficulty of changing culture, but to remember that this is maintained agentially. People make choices. We are not doomed to this culture, but it will take tremendous effort on the part of individual officers, on the part of their sergeants, their lieutenants, and the chief has to be on board. The chief that wants to get rid of Punisher stickers is not going to be a popular chief.
No,
I don't think any reformist chiefs are ever popular with rank and file, but that there is a way to begin to chip away at this that has nothing to do with the policy level change. This is about something that individual officers could change. And if they choose not to, well, then we know that they chose not to.
And I think it's important for officers. I wanted to talk a little bit about what I would hope some police officers might take away from this, and I think you already touched upon it, is having this exaggerated or shared sense of danger that's exaggerated and constantly reinforced. That's not something that's shared by the people that officers are dealing with on a regular basis and interacting with on a regular basis. So I think it's important that police officers be aware of that that is something that's going on with them, that they do have an exaggerated sense of danger, that it's something that's central to their identity as a police officer, and to be aware that the people that they're talking with don't share that view. So their behavior, they need to be aware of how they're presenting themselves, and that shared sense of danger, it influences the way they behave, and people may not understand that. And then also that what you talked about changing that culture, that's not something that's going to be something top down, that it's an individual level effort. Like if you're part of that culture, it's incumbent upon you, if you want that to change, to take those steps to talk to your friends about what type of environment you're creating and what that does. What are the outcomes of that? Are there things that we're doing, that police officers are doing, that they shouldn't be doing, and that it's because they have this exaggerated sense of danger, that they have this fear, and that it's culturally driven, and that a cultural change is the only thing that's going to change that fear and bring it under control, if that makes any sense. Do you have anything else that you'd like to add? Anything you'd like to talk about that we didn't discuss today?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, to add on like what you would tell to officers. I have met a lot more officers that wear all the right gear and have the right stickers, that don't do all the other things that you might expect if the world was as dangerous as they think it is. And by that I mean, they don't like work out. They don't eat right. They drink a lot. They don't train. I happen to train jujitsu. Jujitsu is a really great way to control somebody without punching them in the face or hurting them really, really badly. You could if you wanted to. You could definitely do that. But it's a great control technique, and I think a lot of departments are beginning to incorporate those things. But it's that a lot of it is just the stickers and the gear, and a lot of it just gets done unconsciously. And so to your point, I think if officers can just be more conscious about what they're choosing to do. It's like, so why do you have that sticker on your water bottle? Why do you think that's cool? Why? Have you thought at all about the why behind what you're doing? Because I think that can end up being part of the nefarious feature of very toxic cultures, whether that be masculinity, which is a deep part of this issue within policing, or the danger-specific components of it. A lot of it just gets done unconsciously because it's the way that we do things, or it's the way that officer that I like does things. Why do you like him? Why do you think he's cool? Why do you want to be on SWAT so bad? Why? If it's so dangerous, why are you doing it? If your job is so dangerous, why are you engaging in all these traffic stops that you say are the most dangerous thing that you can do? And empirically they're not, but why? And I think that we don't spend enough time asking why in policing. I think a lot of it, and again, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, a lot of it is we've always done it this way. This is how we stay safe. And we never stop to ask, hey, is that true? And we definitely don't ask why. Why do we do these things? And I think the more that young officers, and ideally some of the older ones that have not asked why in a long time, the more we can ask why. What is the purpose of these things that we're doing? And maybe more importantly, what are some of the potentially unintended consequences of these seemingly mundane things that we're doing? The better equipped we're going to be to make new decisions, or at least better understand what we're doing, which I don't think happens very often.
And I just wanted to thank you for touching on the training portion, because it's something I see a lot, where if officers did take the time to train, and you mentioned jiu-jitsu, I'm also got a blue belt in jiu-jitsu, and when I was an officer, I considered it a part of my job to develop those tools so that I could control somebody, so that when I encountered a dangerous situation, I didn't need to necessarily go to my gun. I had some things on my tool belt where I could buy myself time, I could manage distance, I could think clearly because I'm immersing myself in situations on a daily basis where I'm exposing myself to stress and inoculating myself. So that when I do encounter someone on the street and I am put in a dangerous situation, that I can manage it. And if and like you said, if people are worried about danger, maybe the Punisher tattoo or sticker isn't the best thing to do to manage that fear, but is to develop those tools. So I wanted to thank you very much, and I'm sorry for the technical problems. I'm going to link to your article down below, as well as all
Awesome.
of your information. And if there's any other articles or anything you want to send along for me to add to the links, please do so. And again, thank you very much.
Yeah, no worries, man. Thanks so much. Be safe out there. Take care of yourself.
Thanks.